Hello. Okay, I'm going to talk to Year 11 now about A Christmas Carol, just the day before the exam. A quick recap of the plot and the kind of AO1 comments, AO2 comments and AO3 comments you might make. So just to recap, AO1 comments are really about, well, one, your ability to quote, but you'll be able to do that anyway because you'll have an extract, so you can quote. It's also about your ability to refer to the wider text, so that's any sense of what happens elsewhere apart from in the extract. And then also it's your ability to understand and analyse, critically understand the point of particular things and why they're in the text. That's AO1. AO2 is your ability to pick out individual words and use the subject terminology and say why they've been used and the effect on the reader, what it makes you think, feel and imagine. And then also it's your ability to pick out techniques, so anything structural, like catalyst, etc., or anything like, I don't know, when they say solitary as an oyster, so the simile and about what the effect then is of that. Okay, so that's AO2, and then AO3 is, of course, is about anything to do with the context, so that might be, I don't know, anything to do with Dickens's life or anything about the society at the time, or indeed any kind of interpretations of the text itself and how a modern audience might respond to it. Okie dokie. So let's start with Stave One. So this is, I feel like people are more familiar with this narrative because it's something that people have watched at Christmas quite a lot, which actually was the point of the text. So Dickens wrote it as a book to be read around the Christmas fire or the Christmas tree with family, and therefore it has a moral message because it is trying to teach children something about the way that they should be. But it's also, I would say, deliberately cheery in many respects because of that. So the dead as a door now, although what's particularly dead about a door now I don't know, reference, is supposed to be quite jovial and cheerful, and that's deliberate because it's supposed to be read around the Christmas tree. So if it was all about death and misery and kind of more didactic in its approach to saying that we should give to charity and stuff, it wouldn't really be a very Christmas novel. Okay, so Stave One. We meet at the beginning my favourite character, Ebenezer Scrooge, and he's just the archetypal villain. So we get this character who, just in the description of him, we know that he is a villain. So one, he's hard and sharp as flint, a lovely simile that allows us to understand that actually he's compared to a stone, so he's cold. But again, flint has the potential to create fire and a spark, but we don't see that in Scrooge to begin with. And the fact that he's so hard, there's no give, there's no love, there's no softness to him. So there's a lovely simile to really express what Scrooge is like at the beginning, and also that he's solitary as an oyster, as I referred to a second ago. Another simile, and language-wise, that idea that he's got this hard outer shell, that he won't expose himself to anything and anyone, and won't interact. But again, this sense that there's potential in him because he could create a pearl. So we get this archetypal villain at the start, and actually, like the witches earlier, as I was saying, in Macbeth, he is presented physically as an archetypal villain as well. So we get this character who has got a frosty rime on his head, so he's got white hair, he's got a pointed nose, thin blue lips, and red eyes, all of those things making him seem like a villain. And then he's got this employee, Bob Cratchit, and actually he's horrible to him. He's horrible to him throughout, so throughout the first Stave. So it's cold, and we're told that Ebenezer Scrooge can't even really feel the cold. It doesn't even matter to him. But we've got Bob Cratchit, who's absolutely freezing in the next room, and he's got one piece of coal in the fire, and Scrooge is too stingy to let him have anything else. And actually that links to Scrooge's name, because Scrooge's surname, Ebenezer is his first name, and I'll talk about that later. Scrooge comes from the word scrounge, which is like to be stingy and tight with your money, and of course he's described as tight-fisted as well, the idea that he's grasping onto his money and wealth. So he's established right at the very beginning as somebody who won't even give more than one piece of coal to warm up his only employee, and actually this employee is like trying to warm up around a flame. So we don't like him, but he's almost a caricature. He's so bad that he's a caricature, and I wonder if that's a little bit of Charles Dickens kind of deliberately I don't know, making a caricature of those people of society who are so obsessed with their own wealth, but they don't care about others. And And we see him in his counting house, and that's important because the nouns that we associate with Scrooge at the beginning are we've got a counting house, obviously, and that's associated with money and the lack of homeliness there. And then, especially as it's Christmas Eve, so of course he should be at home with a family or a member or friends or whatever, but he isn't, because the thing that matters to him is money, and of course that's why we find out later he's lost all of those things. And then another noun that we see quite early on in the text in Stave One is banker's note. So he's alone in his melancholy tavern having his melancholy meal, melancholy meaning very sad and lonely, and the only company he's got on Christmas Eve is the banker's notes. So we've got this character anyway. He's established as this archetypal villain because of the way he looks aesthetically, because they talk about even guide dogs wanting to avoid him and that no one talks to him. So he's really isolated as a character, but seemingly isolated because he's not very nice. And he's not very nice to his own employee, Cratchit. And then we get this like whiz of energy comes in. Fred, who's got this really cheerful, bright face, and he comes in and he says, "Merry Christmas," and this is the introduction of one of the key themes in the text, which is the good of Christmas. And so Christmas is introduced as a concept, although we know that it's Christmas Eve, it's really introduced in terms of its traditional sense through Fred. So he's very jolly and wishes him a Merry Christmas, and Scrooge finds it difficult to understand how it is that one could be merry when they don't have money. And he says, like, I don't understand, it's just another day when you don't earn money and when you find that you've got more bills to pay. And Fred's saying, well, actually, you know what? There are many things in the world that can make you happy, that I've derived good from, is what he says, that you don't get money from. And it's the first time that we begin to see this theme arise, that family or kinship or friendship and celebration and togetherness, and indeed Christmas, is more important than money. And he's really jolly about Christmas, and actually he keeps saying Merry Christmas over and over again, and Scrooge feels irritated by that. And Fred asks him to go round to his house. So what we see is Scrooge does have his family. He does have potential to be involved in family, but he chooses to isolate himself. And someone's just commented, like, is he misunderstood? And I think certainly at this time, he just seems like the archetypal villain. Like, there's nothing really redeeming about his character. But of course, when we look later on and we get this introduction about his sister, and we realise that then she's died, and perhaps that's why he doesn't like Fred, I do think that as a reader, we've almost been taught a lesson about judging him without really understanding his motivations, and that in itself is probably a comment about judgment from Dickens. And also, I guess in a way you could say he's misunderstood, because he does have the capacity to change, and by the end of the novel, of course, he does change. So we've got Fred. He is super jolly, and what's interesting about the way that Scrooge responds to him is he is kind of polite, but he's kind of polite in a rude way. So he just repeatedly says to him, "Good afternoon, good afternoon," and every time Fred tries to get anywhere further with him, he just says "good afternoon," which actually in itself is quite a polite thing to say. But of course, repeating it and cutting Fred dead each time is actually quite rude. So he doesn't want anything to do with his nephew, and we don't know why, because his nephew seems so jolly and cheerful. But later on, of course, we find out why. So then Fred leaves. And before Fred leaves, actually, we see Bob Cratchit randomly applaud his little speech about how good Christmas is, and then realise what he's done. And then again, that's quite a comic moment of him going, "Oh dear, I shouldn't have done that." Fred leaves, and then we get an introduction of two characters who are two men who are quite wealthy. I think they're described as portly. They're quite wealthy. They eat and stuff. So, and they're collecting money for charity so that people at Christmas time can feel that they've got to eat, etc. Now, what's important about that is that, again, it brings out this theme of Christmas. So we've got the idea that at Christmas we should be giving not just to our family and our friends and those who we love, but the people who are needy and need us. And so they ask if they can give him, if he will give any money, and he says, "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" And he says that he is supportive of those institutions, and that brings in a nice contextual point, because at the time the way the government supported the poor had just changed, or relatively recently just changed, with the introduction of the poor law, or the change of the poor law. And essentially people who were really, really struggling were sent to go to workhouses, and the treatment in those workhouses was particularly poor. And so people would get very little food, like really very little food, would have to work very late, and with hard manual labour. They would have to sleep in bunks together, and quite often would be beaten. So it wasn't a nice place to be. And people were frightened of the workhouses. And actually that's reflected in what the man says to Scrooge, which is, many would rather die. And Scrooge's brilliantly unempathetic response is, well, then they should get on and do it and decrease the surplus population. Now, the surplus population, again, brings in a contextual point, because a kind of social commentator, philosopher, sociologist guy called Malthus had written about population and population growth, and there had been an extreme growth in population at the time, and lots of people were frightened that there would be too many people and that they wouldn't be able to, the country wouldn't be able to sustain those people, and many of those, the more population were working class, and below that actually, and so people were quite afeared about the idea of the working class having lots of children and it not being sustainable. And Malthus had talked about that, and he described them as the surplus population. Dickens found that idea to be an affront. And I think it's worth noting that although I just got a lovely comment from Charlie, it's worth reading what he's written about Malthusian's perspectives there. What's interesting is that Dickens himself, although he'd originally come from quite a middle-class background, his dad had gotten a lot of debt and ended up going to prison for that, which I think is why the reference of why there are no prisons. And Dickens had then been forced to work. And actually, when Dickens was a famous novelist and a journalist, and he fought for working class rights throughout that time, he didn't actually tell people that he'd ever been poor. And it was almost like there was, a secrecy about that or a shame attached to that, but he certainly understood it, and because he had empathy, he would argue for them. So the Malthusian thing would have really irritated him, which is, I think, why he references it. So Scrooge is like, are there no prisons? Are there no thingies? And then basically workhouses, and then he says that they should get on and die. So we see a guy who is almost a caricature of the middle class or the upper middle class who don't give a damn about anybody, and that's what we see. And then we get this nice section where he says to Bob Cratchit, like, I'm cross that you have to have a day off and that I don't get to get you to work, because it seems like I've got to pay you and you don't come to work, and that just seems unfair to me. No sense that there's one day off a year, which for a modern reader is quite amusing, because obviously we have like a minimum amount of holidays, and as a teacher, it's like I get 13 weeks of holiday in comparison to Bob Cratchit's one day. So, then anyway, Dickens takes Scrooge off. So Scrooge goes off, and we start to see a little bit about Scrooge's life. Scrooge eats on his own. It's Christmas Eve, and it's important that you keep referring back to that. It's Christmas Eve. So we've got all of the ideas of what Christmas should be. But Scrooge is alone, and he's alone because of money. And money is seen here as something that has potential to do good. But if you are tight-fisted and a scrounger, then you will do bad with you will be unhappy with your money, and it will do bad things for you. Scrooge is on his own. Then he goes back to his house, and when he's on his way home, in the door, I can't remember if it's the knocker. Yeah, it's the door knocker, I think. Is it the door knocker? Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the door, it's the door knocker. I always want to say it's the doorknob, but it's the door knocker. He sees Marley's face. Now, Marley, I briefly alluded to him earlier, but that's the business partner. He sees him and thinks, oh, well, I don't know what's going on. And then goes up the stairs and sees a locomotive, they're like hearse. And obviously that's where dead people are taken away in those vehicles, and I think that's an important kind of foreshadowing for what will later happen to Scrooge if he doesn't sort himself out, the idea that he may well die and be taken away, and obviously no one will care. And then he goes home, and basically Marley appears. That's the short version of it. Marley appears, and what's important is how Marley looks. So if you get a question about the ghosts, it's absolutely relevant, not just to talk about the past, present and future, but also to talk about Marley, because Marley is essentially the symbol for what happens if you just let capitalist money rule your life, because he has all of these chains on him, and those chains are symbolic of his sin, and he has to carry those around for all eternity, and that he can't do any good, and that to him is torturous. And he basically says to Scrooge, you will learn. And now this is a clear this is a clear message that money isn't the most important thing, and that actually if you don't do good with your money, it's quite a Christian view in many respects, if you don't do good with your money, you don't share it, then it will be a sin and you will be tortured then forever after because you haven't done good in life. So he sees Marley, he tells him, look, all these ghosts are going to come and it's going to make you change your ways. And Scrooge goes off to sleep. I'm not really sure that Scrooge is quite believing that that's going to happen. And then we get to Stave 2. And in Stave 2, Scrooge gets awoken by one of the ghosts of Christmas past. And he's got this big flame coming out of his head. You would have seen in the various films how that's presented. Some people talk about this flame being representative of hope or casting a light either on the past or on the potential future. And this ghost, actually to begin with, is kind of funny because Scrooge starts speaking with imperatives and kind of ordering the ghost around and saying, oh, well, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do that, and you need to do this. And that shows, I think, that Scrooge is really used to having power. And he's used to having power because he has money. So I'm just, Karen, I hope you can manage to hook up with this because I can see you're having trouble with it. So this ghost takes Scrooge off, and this is important because what we get is some delayed exposition. So Dickens, what he's done quite cleverly, is made us already judge Scrooge. We think that he's this, like I said, this archetypal villain. He isn't a nice character. He's almost a caricature of this selfish middle class, and then we start to understand why. So he takes him back to his school days, and he just sees him as a child, as a little boy, on his own at Christmas time, because his dad doesn't want him to come home, and he hasn't got any friends, they've all gone, and he's on his own, and Scrooge feels a little tear on his cheek, which he then tries to lie and say is a pimple. And we start to think, oh, hang on a minute, maybe there's a reason why Scrooge is like he is. And I think that that's important, that Dickens isn't unsympathetic in his view of society, but he's saying, for whatever reason we may be the way that we are, we all have the capacity to change. So we see Scrooge, he's this lonely little kid, and then we see the sister arrive, and she's like, again, this little ray of light, which of course is this mirroring with Fred, and tells Scrooge that he can go home, and his dad's happy for him to come home. And actually, then we find out why he doesn't like Fred and why he doesn't want to be near Fred, and it's because he mentions that that Fan's died, and of course that's, we think, then one of the reasons that he tries to isolate himself. And what he doesn't realise is that although it's painful to be with Fred, we can infer that it was painful for him to be with Fred. And all of this would be a nice AO1 discussion, really. Although it's painful for him to be with Fred, that actually Dickens's message is very much that you have to embrace the family that you have. So even though it might be painful, it's important. And we see that at the end, of course, with how much happier it makes him, and the way that he then gets family beyond his own family with his relationship with Tiny Tim. So essentially, we see him as a little boy. We then go and see other parts of his past. So we see, can't remember if it's Fezziwig first or if it's Belle first. But, I mean, that's irrelevant, really, because you're not being tested on the order. But Fezziwig, so is his old boss, and he's having a wonderful time. I think that comes first. He's having a wonderful time with him, and what we see is Scrooge at a time when he was able to interact, and what that does is it makes him reflect on the things that he's lost. So he slowly lost relationships, and it makes him reflect on that. And what we see is that he did have the capacity to be a social, friendly, shining character, and because of that, we know that he has the potential to be like that. And then we see his relationship with Belle, and basically she says, listen, I'm below you in class now, and money is something that you're obsessed with, and because of that, I don't want to be engaged to you anymore. You would never be engaged to me now because I'm so much lower class than you. And then we see him be separate from her, and he's clearly upset about it, but I think what's important here is that Dickens is saying, if you just value money, you will lose the most important thing, and the most important thing is people. And you can use money, of course, to engage people and help people, as he does at the end, and that's very much one of the messages of the book. So he loses Belle, and then we see this kind of tragic sequence, really, where he watches Belle with her new family. This is much later when she's older, and she's got a daughter and she's got a husband, and the husband says, "Oh, I saw Scrooge today and he was really lonely." And there's this really sweet section where Scrooge looks at Belle, her husband, and Belle's daughter, and sees that he could have had a child, and that because he was obsessed with money, he never got to have a family, and feels what it would feel like to have that closeness. And he looks at her, and he talks about the fact that he feels that if he'd have had a child, he would have had a spring in his winter. And of course, spring is symbolic of new things being born and hope and future. And Scrooge is in his winter because he's old and he's getting ready to die. And we have this sense that Scrooge has realised that actually family is the thing that is important in life, and that if you then don't have children and make a family, that there's a futility there, because all he's done is obsess about money, and that's left him alone. And he realises that actually hasn't brought him any spring, hasn't brought him any hope, because when he dies, he will be gone, and that will be that. And so that's quite a tragic little sequence, really. Scrooge is really upset by this and wants to go home. He does go home, and what's important is that at the end of the stave, he squashes, it's kind of like a candle putter outer, I can't think of the word, extinguisher, there's the word, pushes it down and stops this flame, and it's almost like he doesn't want to see it. And I think this is Dickens beginning to explore that social change and personal change is painful, and it is difficult to change. And I think that's important. Someone's asking about quotation. What I would say to you is you don't need to remember quotation. What you do need to be able to do is do analysis of individual words and any kind of similes, metaphors, anything like that you see in the text. If you can do AO2 analysis of that, so all the connotations from those individual words, you then don't need, it is called a snuffer, thank you very much, Charlie Ives, you don't need to do this wider AO2 analysis of the text. You don't need to remember quotes. What you do need to do is remember the plot really well and why things have happened, so you can explore AO1 in the wider text. So I wouldn't waste your time trying to remember loads and loads of quotes. You need to remember the plot really well and think about why and what that says, and then any contextual things you can link to. That is enough, because you could still get full marks just doing AO2 analysis of the extract you've got. You don't need to do AO2 analysis of the whole thing. Okay, so he puts the snuffer out. Then we move on to Stave 1, 2, 3, The Ghost of Christmas Present. Now, this is wordplay. This came as a surprise to my Year 11s the other day, or not all of them, in fact, not to Charlie. But Christmas Present, it's a play on words, because obviously it's present as in the present time, but it's also present as in to give. And so much of the novel is about giving. And so we've got this kind of like Father Christmas character, essentially. So Scrooge wakes up and he can't see the ghost, and he's not really sure, and then he goes into the room, and then the room is like decorated with like a proper feast table, and we've got this jolly giant, as I was described, jolly giant character who is dressed in the traditional green, as it used to be, Father Christmas outfit with the rim. And actually we were discussing just in Year 11 the other day that if you think about Christmas Carol is having quite a socialistic message about giving and about benevolence. That's pretty much what Father Christmas is. He, at a time of celebration, spends all of his time giving to strangers. So he's a perfect symbol, really, for this particular ghost. And then you get the Ghost of Christmas Present, and he's super, super jolly, but quite intimidating. Scrooge finds him quite intimidating. He can't look him in the face properly, and he finds him, I think, a little bit intimidating. And then he takes him out, and actually what we see all around is jolliness and Christmas present. So taking advantage of the present brings joy, and so he's got these sprinkles and he puts them on people's food and it makes them jolly. And actually, I think what's important there is that is a message from Dickens, I think, about taking advantage of the present and appreciating the present, and not always worrying or just thinking about saving money and things like that. And so then we get taken to the Cratchit family. So we've only seen Bob as this kind of, I don't know, crushed down work figure, and that's all that Scrooge saw him as. He just saw him as a person who was a worker for him, not anything else. And so what we then see is we see his home, and he's got this lovely family. So although he is poor, he is happy. And of course he perfectly illustrates what Fred talked about earlier, which is that there's so much good that can come from Christmas, and you don't have to be rich to be happy. And then it's really nice because what we see is an introduction of Tiny Tim. So Tiny Tim is Bob Cratchit's son. He's very small and he's got a disability. They're not really specific about that, but I think it's just because he's supposed to represent the working class ill who can't afford to get care, and that's it. And basically, he's a really promising, lovely little boy, and of course Dickens has made him that way because that allows him to get his message across. These children shouldn't die. You cannot see them as surplus population because they are lovely, promising human beings. And the fact that he makes them so small with his cute little alliterative name that's quite catchy, the idea of tiny makes you feel like it's something you need to protect. And so we meet Tiny Tim, and what's sweet about Tiny Tim is on the way back from church, Bob Cratchit says that he was really pleased in a way that he was disabled on that particular day because people might see him and remember the miracles of Jesus. So he's really thankful and really thoughtful and a lovely little boy. And then of course Scrooge is like, oh my God, is Tiny Tim going to die? Because it's important to know that many people didn't want to go to the hospital because they were quite crowded, and a lot of infections actually were caught at hospital. People died often, and only richer people could afford for a doctor to go to their house. So Tiny Tim the NHS didn't exist, so that he wouldn't have had proper healthcare. And Scrooge is worried and thinks that he might die. And the ghost then throws back at him what he said about, well, it will decrease the surplus population, won't it? And that's really very much the point, which is when you talk about class and when you talk about whole swathes of people, and I would say that's really common now with immigrants. People talk about immigrants as a whole, and they've decided that they're bad already. They've decided that in this particular book that the working class are bad and that we should just get rid of them because they're the surplus population. And actually, what's important, Dickens is saying, is that you need to look at the individual because every individual matters and every individual is a child or has promise or whatever. Anyway, the day passes and of course the ghost gets older during the day, and it's because he is the present, and so he will be alive for this one day. And we see lots of different people celebrating. Essentially, they skip from place to places you would never expect on this old ship and things. Never expect people to be celebrating, and everyone's celebrating. And the point is that you don't have to have money to be happy. You have to have company, and you have to have Christmas spirit. And then at the end, of the sequence, we see these two children. So he opens up, there's this big kind of coat throw thing he's got, and two tiny starved children come out, and they're named Ignorance and Want, and he tells Scrooge that they are his children. And what's so tragic about that is that Scrooge has already realised that it was a mistake not having children, and now the children that he's got, that he has bred through ignoring the poor and through being essentially like really selfish with his money, is he's bred ignorance and want. So people are not able to be educated and they are not able to be fed just because he and others like him and his class are ignoring the poor, and so they're starved. And again, it's interesting that they've used children because children are the future, and the future is it should be hopeful, but indeed in this particular context it's going to be a future of ignorance. It's going to be a future of want and need and hunger. Somebody has just put a funny message about where are the Christmas carols. I'll crack out a song at the end. So anyway, and then the ghost vanishes, and I think it's important because there's like enough said there really with the children figures, and Scrooge is left to figure it out for himself. And then we get the ghost of Christmas yet to come, and it's interesting. You might get a question about how powerful the ghosts are or the power of the spirits, and of course the most important answer to that question when you do the novel as a whole is they are powerful because they change Scrooge, and if Scrooge can change, society can change. So they are, essentially like a catalyst for social change. But then if you zoom in on particular parts of the text, this particular Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come is really powerful because he looks like death. So obviously that's the ultimate power, of course, that will come to get us all regardless of our class. And that's a unifier as well. The Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come, who looks like death, unifies everyone of every class because everyone will die regardless. And he's scary, and I think it's interesting that he is so powerful over Scrooge that Scrooge comes to his knee straight away, and it just says, like, I know you've got a lesson to teach me, let's just do it. And the ghost doesn't even speak ever, and that silence is very powerful. If you can be silent and the most powerful person in the room, then you obviously have extreme power. And he takes them to go and see different people, and there's a nice bit, I don't know if you would call it dramatic irony, but there's a bit where, as a reader, we clearly understand that it's Scrooge who's died, but Scrooge, I guess to create this building tension of the rising action before he realises, he doesn't realise that it's him. So we see these people, and they're all talking about this dead man, and nobody cares about the dead man. The only reason they would go to his funeral is because you get free food. And actually, there's a nice comedy bit in here as well. I was talking about the fact that, although it's quite a serious novel with a serious message, it's got these comedy bits. And we've got this, the guy who's just disgusting. He's got bogies hanging down from his nose, and they describe it as pendulous. Yuck. Like a big pendulum of swinging bogey snot. And that's, again, deliberately done for comic intent. So we get these characters, and they just don't care that Scrooge is dead. And what's sad about that is that he realises that everything he's done in his life that he thought gave him power, and he thought was important, like money and the banker's note, actually it isn't powerful, because essentially, when he's died, there's nothing left behind, and there's no one to leave his money to either. And so he's died. Nobody cares, and then he gets taken to the really poor. And if you get a question about poverty, you do want to talk about these people, because obviously they steal from his bedroom whilst his body's still there. I think one of them takes the shirt off his back, which is just gross. And the bed, they take down the bed curtains and all sorts of stuff. So he's dead in the bed, and they're taking the stuff from around him. And in a way, I think this gives a slightly more balanced view of the working class. So they're not all just this perfect little family. Like, Dickens is realistic about it, but I also think you can, to some degree, excuse what they do, because they are actually poor, they are actually starving. And so what they do is somewhat more forgivable than the way Scrooge reacts, which is he won't give to anyone, and he'd rather everybody died and doesn't care, when he has the capacity to give. Anyway, so Scrooge is then watching, thinking, oh wow, who is this guy that's died? And they take him, of course, like in this lovely, a pathetic fallacy, by the way. It's not just weather, it can also be place. So there's pathetic fallacy in the fact that he takes him to this graveyard, and it's this kind of building tension, and he walks to the headstone, and then Scrooge reads the words Ebenezer Scrooge, which is obviously his name, and he realises, oh, hang on a minute, I'm the person that's died. And then he has this huge revelation about his life, and about how the fact that actually, what's been the point of it? Because nobody cares that he's dead, and nobody wants that. And then after his death, he's going to have these chains to carry around. And actually the only way to change that is to do good. And then it's important, the nomenclature is important here. So Dickens' nomenclature. Nomenclature, for those of you who don't know, is Dickens' naming of things. So he's called Ebenezer Scrooge. Well, I've already talked about Scrooge meaning scrounge, but Ebenezer means like memorial stone. And so it's about, his memorial stone will be about him being scroungeful is not a word, scrounging, and a scrounge. And I think that what he's one of Dickens's message through the nomenclature is that you will be remembered for the things that you do and the way that you interact with people. And in this particular case, Scrooge is being remembered for something negative. And then Scrooge is just massively distressed, and he begs and says, like, why would you show me this if I can't change it? Please allow me to change it. And then suddenly it all just goes crazy, and he finds himself suddenly in bed and he's on his own. And then he wakes up and he isn't sure what day it is or whatever, and he crawls out the window and finds out it is Christmas Day, and he's so excited because what he realises is that he has the capacity to change, and that if he changes, he won't die. Maybe Tiny Tim won't die, and maybe people will care when he dies. And so he rushes into the street, and we see a great comparison to how he's at the beginning and how he is at the end. And so this, of course, is Dickens's message that we all have the capacity to change. And so he I forgot to mention the Fred's party. He sees Fred's party and sees them all playing games earlier on in the Ghost of Christmas Present, as well as the Cratchit Family, and that makes him feel left out, and he almost wants to play the games. And that's, again, a message about how important family is and interaction is. Anyway, he runs out and he gets a Christmas turkey delivered to the Cratchits. So that's important because they had a goose. A goose was a much cheaper animal and much smaller, and they wouldn't have been able to afford a turkey, which was the traditional bird for the middle class. So he gets them a turkey, and he just gets the most crazy big one, and sends it all to them. And then he goes round to Fred's house, and Fred is a bit surprised to see him, but with the other guests they engage him, and then they play games and he has a lovely time. And then it very, very quickly at the end of the novel just says, basically, and as the years went on, and we see how he is, and it's basically that he was joyous and giving in every way that one could be, and that some people were like laughed at him, but he didn't even mind that they laughed at him, because his spirit is no longer mean. His spirit is one of Christmas, which is giving and forgiveness. And he just thought, well, I'm happy, so it's fine. And he promises that he will honour Christmas with all of his heart. And again, so it's Christmas and also that Christian message. And we see that he becomes a father figure to Tiny Tim. And then that links in nicely with the message, the final message of Tiny Tim, which is, God bless us, everyone. And the difference is that it is everyone, because now it is Scrooge, and that he is blessing them, and he is being blessed by the company of others. And that's pretty much the end of the text, really. So I just briefly wanted to say, when you're talking about the text and you refer to particular events, that's AO1, but it's quite low level. So just referring to, I don't know, Dickens sends Scrooge off to see this small child of himself crying. And so he's got this small child crying, and he watches himself. That, just referring to that, is fine and would get you some marks, but it would be quite low down on the mark scheme. To get higher marks, you need to say why that's relevant, what it makes you think and feel, why you think Dickens has included it, what it says about his character. So if you started to say, it makes us understand that actually Scrooge was a lonely boy, and that perhaps he was damaged by that as a childhood, and we understand why he might have rejected family, because he was rejected by his own father, and the loss of his sister may have been such a difficulty for him that's why he rejects Fred. All of those kind of things would then be a comment about the event. So that would be AO1 as the basic level, is just referring to the text, and then really exploring it and linking it back to the question on why that works. That is your more detail. And then once you've done that, you just zoom in another paragraph from your extract, and you do your AO2, and your AO2 will just be word level analysis or technique level analysis and connotations. That's pretty much it. That's a lot shorter than Macbeth. It's like half the length of Macbeth, but Macbeth is quite a difficult play. I think it's got many more complex things. Some people have said, how can you show what the reader thinks and feels about Scrooge? I think that what we think and feel about Scrooge is about how he changes. So to begin with, we absolutely judge him. But as the novel develops, what we see is we start to understand him, we understand his reasoning and how these kind of events can happen. And then by the end, he has the capacity to change. And actually, we admire him and we want to be like him. And of course, that's the lesson of the book, that we have all got the capacity to change. And if the worst character in the world, the archetypal villain with a pointed nose, which is obviously witch-like, and red eyes and blue lips, if he can change, if even he can change, then what Dickens is saying is that society can change. And of course, that's then important. Okay, I'm going to go now and have my dinner. Year 11, I will see you at 7:45 tomorrow with your good luck exam socks, which I've been busy making today. So I will see you then. All right, bye, good luck. If you need anything, just give me a tweet and I will send you. So if you need any practice questions or anything like that. Okay, take care, bye-bye.